at the Jack H. Skirball campus of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in LA. Prior to coming to HUC, he served on the staff of AJC, of the Jewish Federation, of the JCRC, and of the LA Federation. And during his time at the college, he served for 10 years as the director of its School for Jewish Nonprofit Management and was named to the deanship in the LA campus. Between 2012 and 2014, he was invited to teach classes at USC and at Nanjing University, if I'm saying that right, in China. He's offered 4 books, numerous articles. You have likely read some of them that we sent out and shared. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania, and his research has been primarily focused on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. Currently, he is editing a volume for the Kazan Institute of USC on Donald Trump's impact on American Jews, which is scheduled to come out in late spring of 2021. He is a board member of Hillel 818, and he is a fellow of the Jerusalem Institute of Public Affairs and a board member of Pat Brown Institute of Cal State, LA. And for the past 6 years, he's been on the faculty of the Memorial Foundation of Jewish Culture. We are very grateful to have him with us this evening because he's an expert in exploring Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior, and has a unique ability of bridging division in our times, helping us to shed new light on how we understand our very serious role as voters in America and as Jews in America. We take our obligation to support our country and to envision and be a part of its creation for the future very seriously at B'nai David, where we are a polling site, which is something to be very proud of. And as you saw in Rav Yosef's email earlier today, we bring a spiritual approach to what it means to be a country that is bipartisan and aligned together with Jewish values. And one of the things that we're very grateful that the Windmueller is going to discuss tonight is addressing really how we as a shul, as a spiritual community that is very bipartisan, we have many voices in our shul and we value that. How do we talk to each other right now about politics, if at all? And what is the way to keep us together as a community and feel connected and to find hope in these times? He is going to share his expert wisdom and his experience working in the field and giving us a new lens to approach this election, especially thinking of ourselves both as Americans and as Jewish voters. So with that, we are incredibly grateful that you're sharing your time and your wisdom with us. I want to thank especially Adina for bringing the connection with you to us. She's a fantastic executive director. We love her, and we are so happy that we can make a connection with you through her. So thank you again for being with us.
Well, thank you, Rabbanit. Also to Rabbi Kanevsky and to all of the individuals associated with B'nai David-Judea, and to my former student, Adina, for indeed being the maker of this moment, and to Jennifer for her help as we proceed through this conversation.
And I forgot to mention that if you have questions for the Windmueller, please put them into the chat privately to me or to Jen throughout so that we may share them with him at the very end.
Very good. And I look forward especially to your questions and to your concerns. So why don't we move forward, Jennifer, with our next slide. I think it's important to remind ourselves that American Jews have been a part of this society from its very beginnings. And this deep political connection to the development and evolution of American society is a powerful piece to why Jews hold multiple ideas, express support for various movements and causes, precisely because they are so much a part of the American story. Jews historically and continuously have taken great pride in both being Jewish and being active as part of the American scenario. Let us move to the next slide. This expression of engagement with American society is really framed in multiple different ways. From the revolutionary times forward, we would find this association of American Jews with the political culture. And I would reference George Washington's letter to the Jewish community of Newport on the occasion of his election and inauguration as our first president. He closes that letter with the following statement: "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. This contract, in a sense, that Washington begins to create and that the Jewish community begins to formulate, is framed around the First Amendment to the Constitution with its religious liberties and freedoms. It is expressed in the 6th article of the Constitution with its emphasis on there shall be no religious tests when accepting public office. It is also seen in the rise of Jewish personalities. From Francis Salvador, the very first soldier who was to be killed in the American Revolution, who was of Spanish Jewish descent, or the stories of America's heroes, including Haym Salomon, or Judah P. Benjamin and others who would emerge as political players in the 19th century to help shape this story. And in fact, the very first Jew elected to the Congress of the United States would be from Florida. His name, David Yulee. He would be elected in 1845, and he would lead a tradition of Jews being elected to state, city, federal offices for the entire history of our nation. And indeed, that political story begins very much around Lincoln. Lincoln dies on Passover, 1865, and the expressions of sympathy in synagogues across this country in the 1865 moment was powerful and informative. Lincoln's leadership would drive and create a response on the part of American Jews who from 1864 till 1908 would vote for the GOP, the Republican Party. It would be reflective of his profound influence in shaping their ideas and politics. But yet throughout the history of Jews in America, we have seen the very deep presence of Jews in all types of public office, including in the current Congress, the 116th Congress, where we have 28 Jewish members, 2 of whom in the House are Republican, the remaining are Democrats, and 9 United States senators in this current session. In 1993, we would see the largest single expression of Jewish political participation in the Congress, with 51 members of the House and Senate being Jewish. But the 2020 story is about Jewish candidates and Jewish funders, Jewish activists and commentators, whether Republican or Democrat. The storyline is the high profile that American Jews are playing in the political sector. The next slide, please. Americans by reality do not vote. In fact, no more than 60% of eligible voters are participating in local, state, and even federal elections. The highest numbers we record is in 1908, when some 65% of eligible voters turned to the polls. And indeed, only in the Kennedy-Nixon campaign of 1960 did we come anywhere near that, with 63.5% of voters who were eligible participating. But that is not the Jewish story. Jews are voters and active. By that matter, we have studies that suggest that anywhere from 72% to 95% of eligible Jewish voters participate. In fact, the Omaha, Nebraska Jewish population study of 2 years ago points to the fact that when asked, the Jewish voters of Omaha indicated that 95% of them are active participants in the political affairs of their community, state, and nation. The newest role of American Jews has been around funding. They are today major funders in both political parties. 1 out of every $2 raised in the Democratic Party is raised from Jewish sources. And 1 in every $4 raised for Republican candidates and Republican agendas are from Jewish donors. This is the storyline of the last of these series of elections where Jews have been high profiled. Hillary Clinton in 2016 received from her top 5 donors who were Jewish a significant amount of her resources. And Donald Trump's campaign reported that 7 of his top 17 donors were Jewish Americans as well. So what can we expect this November, and what do we need to know? We are looking at one of the largest turnouts that we have seen. If we had 138 million voters in the 2016 campaign for Clinton versus Trump, we are likely to see in 2020 a turnout in excess of 155 million. There are 20 million new voters not available to us 4 years ago. These are people who are emerging as young voters, new American citizens, who are taking the opportunity, we believe, to be casting their first ballots. And across the nation already at this moment, with still 8 days to go before the election itself, we see something close to 60 million votes that have already been cast in each of the 50 states. And what we are seeing is a record turnout of pre-voting, the largest pre-voting in the history of the nation. Part of this is in response to concerns about protecting the ballot, questions related to whether ballots will be safe and will be counted and will arrive on time. These are the issues that spark not only Jewish voters, but across America, the rise of voting participation. The next slide. My colleague, Professor Gil Troy of McGill University, and a historian, writes, Jews are more pro-choice than pro-Israel. We will come back to what that means and why it is significant. But it is a reflection on Jewish liberalism in America and Jewish political orientation. But the fact that Jews vote in exceptionally high numbers, as I've noted to you, is part of their American passion, where they have joined together their Jewish commitments and their deep belief in American democracy. Milton Himmelfarb in the 1970s suggested that Jews live like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans is a statement that still holds great reserve and value in that it reflects the high degree by which Jews are liberal in their orientation and reflect an upper mobility in their economic development. We would remind ourselves that Hillary Clinton in 2016 received 71% of the Jewish vote. And our estimates based on the New York Times exit polling, Donald Trump at 24%. But what is important to realize is that American Jews, for the most part, 75% of us to be exact, live in 8 states, accounting for 188 electoral votes. In some cases, these states are in play in 2020, certainly Pennsylvania, Florida, and those voters are deeply and directly affected. What some Jewish analysts are suggesting is that there is a bagel belt that has formed that brings the South, the Midwest, and the Far West together around specific states, including Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, Ohio, and Florida. These voters and their Jewish participants in particular are amongst the most important in this election, because in all reality, this election will be decided as previous elections of the 21st century around key battleground states where you have 1 to 1.5% Jewish voting capacities in these states, and where those voters are very much in play. The next slide. We're going to, in the next 2 slides, take a look back for a moment before moving forward, just to remind ourselves of the behavior patterns of American Jewish voters overall, and the reality of what American Jewish political behavior is becoming. I point to the 1948 election in which Harry Truman wins that election, but I refer you to the 15% of Henry Wallace's vote. Wallace is a left of center Democrat. He is the last of a vintage of socialists and progressives that were deeply supported and embraced by the Jewish voters. Between 1900 and 1932, we saw a significant number of voters moving to these third-party candidates in support of progressive and very liberal and even socialist ideas. Let's move to the next slide. Political scientists are deeply struck by the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan against Jimmy Carter with John Anderson as the third candidate. the fact is that this is an election where 39% of Jewish voters voted for Ronald Reagan. That is the highest number that we would see in the 20th century of Jewish support for Republicans beginning from 1932 with Franklin Roosevelt's election. And the question that political analysts raise is, why did the president lose 8 points when he ran in 1984? And we looked back at the 1983 rise of the moral majority and its focus on Christianity as a voice in American politics. And for many American Jews, this was scary and uncertain. And so we saw a demise or decline in the number of supporters for the Reagan presidency. We shift to 2008, and we see Barack Obama, likewise in his 2 elections, dropping a significant number of points as well. And here again, we looked at a variety of factors. President Obama would lose support from women, from African Americans and other groups, including Jewish Americans, in his second run against Mitt Romney. And part of that was reflected in policy, and part of it was about the nature and quality of his opposition. So we watch elections in terms of even the slightest transitions of voting behavior. The next slide, please. I want to take a look in this slide and then in the next slide at the 2 major political themes in American public life: conservative thought, republicanism, and then later democratic liberalism. Jewish conservative tradition is deeply rooted in the history of Jewish life in Europe and across the world. And in fact, American Jews are the most liberal of all voting constituencies of all Jewish groups in the diaspora and beyond in Israel as well. And in understanding the rise of conservative political behavior, we looked at the deep historic ties between the Jewish community and governments, between the Jewish community and key political figures who represented conservative values and traditions. I believe that there are 5 types of Jewish Republicans, and I am quickly going to list these to identify their characteristics. Identity voters tend to vote their passions. Is it good for me? Is it good for the Jews in this case? And see, amongst other issues, Israel, the fight for national security, concerns that speak specifically to anti-Semitism, that define and drive identity voters. Neoconservative voters grew up in the Reagan years and were particularly influential in the Reagan administration in defining American foreign policy in defense of Israel on behalf of democracies and preserving America's role as a key voice in international affairs. Ideological conservatives can be generally found in the Midwest and South and have deep and abiding ties to the GOP from a variety of connections that their families and their communities hold with Republican and conservative values and practices. These are longstanding voters and are particularly interesting because of their deep and ongoing dedication to the Republican Party. Religious value conservatives are often described as evangelicals in the case of Christianity, or in the case of American Jews, the Orthodox community. And indeed, overwhelmingly, we see a growing presence of Orthodox Jews in support of Republican politics and candidates. We will speak more definitively about that shortly, in particular for this audience, as it's an important and key understanding of what is happening to American Orthodoxy in the 2020 elections. We do find a number of prominent Republicans who define themselves as never Trump Republicans. Some have joined the Lincoln Project to defeat the president, and others are electing to sit out the election or to vote libertarian in opposition to the Trump presidency. Next slide, please. American liberalism is frequently identified and tied to reform and even to conservative Judaism, but its roots are actually far more tied to various progressive and socialist ideas that grew up in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, and that were framed as part of the evolution of liberalism in the Western world and certainly here in the United States. It's deeply embedded in the organizations that many secular and liberal Jews belong to that lie outside of the Jewish community, including the ACLU or other causes that align with the viewpoints of many American Jewish liberals. Here again, there are a number of types of Jewish liberals. The universal progressives are those that have tended to be more supportive of the left wing of the Democratic Party, including those who have been Bernie Sanders supporters and Elizabeth Warren advocates. What we have noted about them in 2016, a number of these voters did not support the Clinton candidacy. The liberal suburban Democrats are the traditionalists. As with Republicans, they have deep roots and ties to democratic institutions that are aligned with the ideas of liberal and progressive politics, and have long been supportive of the Democratic Party and its candidates. They tend to be mostly in the large metropolitan areas. And as a result, we found that Hillary Clinton, for example, won 100 of the most populated counties in America across the board, whether Houston or here in Southern California or in metropolitan New York or in other major communal and metropolitan districts. Donald Trump won 3,100 counties outside of these highly populated areas, showing the deep and significant divide between liberalism of the urban setting and the realities of suburban and rural American politics. Urban activists are younger American Jews whom we are studying because they are tending to vote as independent voters. Born often in Jewish democratic households, they have been seen to register as independent voters and tend to want the option of being able to select between both parties and being also independent of either party. Red diaper babies are a fascinating group. These are the great, in times great-great-grandchildren of the early socialists. Their parents or grandparents were anti-war activists in the 1960s, and they have become very much on the far left edge of the political spectrum. When you see the term libertarians here, you would wonder, aren't libertarians more naturally aligned with the Republican Party? Political scientists believe that Jewish libertarians, maybe because of their deep moral and social consciousness about issues and culture, align more with the democratic value proposition, even though they will not vote necessarily Democratic, but see the role of government to be far less invasive and want from government a role to be played in cooperation with nonprofits, the sector of business, and the civic square as a way of really downsizing the high profile of government as the defining architect of American society. The next slide, please. This election is all about Donald Trump, as we know. And in many ways, the questions and concerns about this election have centered on his presidency and his policies. The second concern in 2020 is certainly about making it possible for foreign influence to be contained, for voter suppression to be minimized, and disinformation to be channeled and controlled. In many ways, this election and this year is all about the 2020 census, because how states define and reapportion themselves in terms of districts, the number of seats they are entitled to, and the kinds of politics we will see moving into the next 10 years is created exactly at this moment in terms of the completion of the 2020 census, which will be shortly concluded. The fourth factor in today's election is certainly about conspiracy theories and the need to contain, control, and deal with rebuilding trust as a critical factor in American politics and American life. As conspiracies delude and disengage people from belief in and support of political causes, the need to rebuild and reaffirm the trust issues is essential. We find as well in 2020 the interesting corollary that Jews are deeply connected not only as candidates, but in so many other ways. For example, there are 4 Jews running for the Senate in states that one would not normally expect. Wyoming, an Israeli American running for the United States Senate. In Alaska, a physician taking on the incumbent senatorial leader. And in states such as Georgia, we see as well the presence of a Jewish candidate. The reality is that in this election, we see 47 American Jews running for public office for the Senate, the House, and for other key positions of importance to their states and to the national governance. Next slide, please. In many ways, what I mentioned earlier is the rising importance of American Orthodox voters. And this has been reflected in a number of different ways. We now have for the first time a significant number of new studies about Orthodox Jewish political behavior. For example, we have a study that suggests that Donald Trump will score as much as 83% of the Orthodox Jewish vote, whereas in other studies we have that number is reflected at 66%. We see from an LA Jewish study done a year ago that LA Orthodox Jews indicated a 70% level of support for the president. So we begin with the principle of expressing this deep tie that Orthodox Jews in America have for republicanism and for the Trump presidency. We also see an increasing debate inside the Orthodox community, including an interesting and important conversation that occurred this summer in a letter drafted by seven prominent Orthodox Jews, which was entitled Sinai, Not Washington. In it, they write, the unhealthy confusion of Torah values with politics brings disrepute to Torah and harm to Torah Jews, as they seek to make sure that no one voice is in some sense dominant or controlling of the ideas and thinking of Orthodox Jews. In an article just last week, we read about the growing rise in Brooklyn in particular of what's called Hamisha populism. This popularism is designed in a sense and was seen on the streets of Brooklyn as the Hasidic communities, among others, rose to disagree with the governor and mayor of New York in terms of the feelings associated with COVID restrictions and requirements. This assertion of Orthodox presence in politics is a new reality and points to the increasing growing role of voters within that community. It is also reflected in the fact that there are huge numbers of publications that now are produced by and for the community, whether it's Matzav or Yeshiva World News or Five Towns, Jewish Times or Mishpacha or other publications. This growth in the expression of an orthodoxy of ideas and values in politics is a story unto itself. If 54% of Orthodox Jews in America supported President Trump 4 years ago, we believe, based on the numbers I've already cited, that those will significantly increase. But what we do note is a divide between modern Orthodox Jews and Haredi, or more traditional Jews. And that is a conversation unto itself in terms of the nature of that divide and of its importance. The other distinction we are making based on our work on Orthodoxy and its political power is that there is a clear distinction between the Jews of the greater New York metropolitan area and Orthodox Jews living elsewhere, both in terms of their political activism, as well as the degree to which they are engaged in some of the political choices that are deeply reflected in the polling data we have seen. The other issues in this chart suggest, of course, the great divide in the Jewish community that we have discussed and have seen for a good number of years. We see a huge amount of that around Israel, but we also see it around other questions, including the conversations and disagreements about the president himself. What we also have noted is that since 2016, we have seen a huge acceleration of Jewish activism, both on the left and the right. And this has been particularly significant as well within the Orthodox Jewish community. The surge in Jewish political giving is significant. And the new story to that line is that Los Angeles has replaced New York and Florida as the central address for both Jewish Republicans and Jewish Democrats in terms of giving. It has become the new mecca of big dollars, as both San Francisco and Los Angeles have assumed a higher profile in the fundraising arena. What is of concern to the American Jewish community, whether from the left or the right, is the rise of anti-Semitism, the use of social media to portray and carry negative stories and imagery about Jews, and the violence we have seen on the streets, all of which are of primary concern to Jewish voters of all stripes in this election. Indeed, there is some anxiety over what will happen on November 3rd and what will follow from it. While none of us are in a position to make any expectations, the importance is to understand that the possibilities of political discord and violence remain. Next slide, please. The current polls that we do have on Jewish voting are taken from three sources: the Jewish Electorate Institute in a September study, the Pew and AJC, American Jewish Committee studies of October, that reflect the total of American Jewish political thinking, including, of course, the reflections of Orthodox Jewish voting patterns, as I've previously described. Next slide, please. When looking at voting issues on the part of American Jewish voters, these issues may not necessarily reflect your priorities, but they are taken from two studies of Jewish cohorts. The American Jewish Committee survey taken just this month of 1,334 Jewish leaders, and an earlier study in September by the Jewish Electorate Institute. But note the high profile of healthcare and the issues of the economy when looking at this study. Also, I would remind you that Jews are the oldest voting constituency in white America. That is, no other religious ethnic group in America is as old as the Jewish cohort voting in the 2020 elections. As a result, Social Security, Medicare, healthcare would be natural ingredients for an older community to be concerned about. But also note the high profile of the Supreme Court, which is an important indicator, again, of where Jews believe the values and institutions of this country are, in a sense, governed and controlled. Israel, as I had noted earlier, is not a high profile. And as Gil Troy reminded us, it is not a playing issue in the 2020 election. No, it does not mean that all Jews do not weigh in on the Israel agenda. It means that increasingly large numbers of Jews, when polled around what issues are of concern to them, place Israel in a low profile position. Political scientists work on the following notion about such issues. If an issue is in crisis, i.e., if Israel and the United States were in disagreement today over whatever the consideration, that issue, that is the case for Israel, would rise proportionately as important to American Jews. But at a time when the Israel agenda is in play only in a secondary way, it does not take on the kind of ingredient of importance as other issues defined here. The next slide, please. What we will be looking at in the future will be really a series of fundamental changes. We are seeing the huge influx of new voters, but that will also translate by the year 2050 to an American society which will be multicultural and multiracial. It will reflect profound implications for the American Jewish community, as our community itself is changing. In the LA study of 2019, we saw already that 13% of this Jewish community were Jews of color, pointing to the increasing changes that we are demographically looking at, not only inside the Jewish community, but across the American demographic picture. By the year 2040, Islam will replace Judaism in the United States as America's third major religious community. Catholic, Protestant, Jewish will now be reflected with Islam as the replacement to Judaism. When looking at anti-Semitism and hate politics, every American Jew, including today's latest study, which came out earlier this morning by the American Jewish Committee on Anti-Semitism in America, and indeed increasing numbers of Jews place anti-Semitism as a major concern for them. In this study, 88% of Jews who were interviewed indicated a heightened concern of anti-Semitism, believing it has increased in this country and is of danger to the well-being of Jews and their security. The whiteness factor is the critical and bottom line concern. The alt-right, where 64% of American Jews believe that right-wing anti-Semitic behavior is highly problematic and the worst of all of our fears, that this whiteness factor is driven by a significant amount of belief that Jews are seeking to replace us, where Jewish power and Jewish influence has grown, and the far right seeks to push back against the growth and presence of Jews. This comes to us in a week in which we memorialize 2 years ago this week, the events at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, simply reminding us of the issues of whiteness and Jewish presence. From the left, some 16% of Jewish respondents suggest that the left is the more dangerous element and argue that the movement to deny Israel its equal status and place and the efforts to create a BDS campaign against Israel is seen as dislodging and problematic. And the fear of political activism on the left, which is hostile to Jewish interests and to American Jews, is also raised in this context. The third issue of concern is the civic engagement question. I used the term trust earlier, and here I simply refer back to that notion. American Jews have a profound sense of trust in government, believe in its value, believe in its leadership, and have historically supported the institutions and the candidates running for public service. That is unique among Americans' institutional groups. Other Americans are far less committed and are far more concerns about the viability and welfare and health of American democracy. The re-establishment of democracy and trust in its institutions is a critical issue that Jews will be looking at in this post-election period. So a changing American majority, the rise of hate politics and anti-Semitism, and the loss of trust in institutions are the challenges that I see and think we need to be responsive to. Thank you very much. So now we want to open the conversation to your questions and welcome your feedback to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Windmueller. That was, it's an important thing to get to know ourselves better in order to connect more with each other and to take responsibility within our country. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insight. We have a couple of questions that I have. Jen, I don't know if you have any, but others are welcome to send in questions to me or to Jen. The first question, several of them actually that were asked, by the way, you answered in your presentation. So that was a fantastic thing. So one of the questions I'm seeing here is, how do the issues, and I think you were starting to get at this actually at the end, how do the issues that Jews care about right now, top of the list, healthcare and gun violence, compare with the average American voter? Meaning, do American voters generally worry most about healthcare and gun violence, and therefore Jews are no different, or is this remarkable in some way?
It's a fascinating question. We believe that both these issues, gun violence and healthcare, have a higher score with Jews, in part because we are seeing the largest sale of guns that we have seen in many years happening actually during COVID-19. And in the last several weeks, those gun sales have actually spun much higher. Whether that's a reaction to the election or to some other factors is hard to identify. Other American voters have a broader and somewhat different sweep of these questions. First of all, they are generally younger, so that the healthcare issue, while important, does not draw the same degree of intensity among many voters. What seems to be particularly significant is the economy. The high number of Americans out of work or underworking at this point seems to play much higher at this time. A second factor that we see with other voting groups is particular concerns with a relationship to the issue of immigration. Some who oppose it or who have concerns, others who are deeply troubled by what has happened on our borders and seek ways to respond to the crisis of the immigrant, including the question of the status of dreamers and the 11 million folks who, in a sense, are not formally a part of American citizenship, but are here as part of their family coming to the United States. So we have a variety of issues that are both different from and add to what we have seen with Jewish voting behavior. The final point here is the question that foreign policy for no group is a particularly significant issue. Americans generally, unless one is seeing the nation at war or risking or fearing war, this question is generally not a high profile consideration for voters who are deeply embedded in pocketbook and issues associated with lifestyle considerations.
Wonderful. So you'll see in the chat, everyone is able to offer in more questions, but some of them are coming up. One of them is recently a Jewish candidate from Congress attacked George Soros. Is this significant for the Jewish community?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, the play here, as with so many other commentaries about whether it's George Soros or whether it's about another personality who may or may not be high profile, the reality is that there is a kind of crudeness and dysfunctionality to a lot of American politics at the moment. And this has created, in a sense, a license for people to make statements about groups, individuals, or institutions that are highly problematic and often incorrect, even in their judgment. So I'm concerned about that as part of the general sort of culture we've created around politics, which creates something we should talk about in connection with one of the original questions that I should have and probably need to respond to. The great divide that we see in the country, and as is also reflected in the Jewish community, is something that is deeply troubling on two grounds. Minority communities do best when they have achieved a kind of shared identity and shared agenda. When that agenda becomes dwarfed by internal division, it weakens the power and the credibility of a community to convey its issues, to share its objectives. And that is particularly challenging. And whether or not we all agree on the Israel question and all of its characteristics, the reality is that to articulate a case for Israel with the United States Congress, with a new president or a returning president, requires a cohort of shared messaging that allows for the maximum impact of a community to weigh in on its interests. That is actually absent at the moment, and that is particularly challenging for minority societies. The second is the inability for us to talk to one another. And this is a disaster in terms of our institutional capacities to govern and manage. For rabbis, it becomes a challenge about whether they can deliver a sermon. For Jewish professionals, it's a question of, do they bring a controversial issue to a board? For other professionals, it's about whether they teach in schools particular themes and topics that are perceived as either controversial or problematic. And for personal relationships, the ability of families to talk to family and of friends to renew and sustain friendships are serious issues that result from this failure, in a sense, to communicate. I am of the mind that we need to figure out ways by which we create the safe space where conversations can be held and where people are not judged by what they say, but the maximizing of what they are hearing and how they listen and how they are responsive to the ideas that others are putting forward, as long as those ideas are responsible and engaging. So my sense here is that the lines of communication that are needed begin really in the sukkah, for example, in the ability to create a kind of artificial tent that is protective and isolated and secure for conversations that right now aren't happening and that need to happen between father and son and daughter and mom, or between families and friends. It's the critical issue of the Jewish people's very identity and future. It's a role modeling issue, by the way, for others. We need to be able to demonstrate that even with our diversity, we find community and commonality.
Just on that point, are there any, just in the work you've done with communities, have you found any particular pieces of advice or helpful, or any specific practices that maybe our community could benefit from? People could bring home to their families or to people that they don't agree with?
Right. There are a number of initiatives underway. The San Francisco JCRC, for one, have created a whole effort to create guidelines for conversations that we need to have, and laid out a sort of a platform of best practices to achieve that. Other groups are talking about these extraordinary kinds of conversations led by third-party individuals who are trained in communications theory, with the idea of effectively bringing people to the table and teaching them the skills of artful listening and to, in a sense, take off the masks and the notions that certain trigger words imply or reference a particular behavior or belief. And other activities that create the possibilities where we take a look at a shared problem where we come to that problem from different places, but allow for folks who are authorities to help educate and inform us on the background essential to making decisions and understanding the complexities of these issues. And part of this, frankly, will be driven and needs to be driven by elites in the society, whether they're university presidents or they're athletes or they're political officials, or they are folks who have developed through their careers and their accomplishments a level of high esteem and respectability, that these individuals and their institutions around which they have help nurture and create, have to build and create the framework for the rest of the society to emulate. I think what we're going to see after November 3rd is something rather fascinating. I believe we will be seeing an effort on the part of political elites from both parties to begin to diffuse the atmosphere in this country and to sort of play out some of the necessary behaviors and outcomes that we are going to be required if we're going to tackle some of these great challenges.
We have one question in the main chat. It's kind of a two-part. So do you see anything in terms of potential Jewish flight from America on either left or right? For our country has been a safe haven in recent decades, but are Jews now feeling unsafe enough to consider leaving?
Jennifer, it's an interesting question. And I only here have some observations rather than data. I would say that in the American Jewish Committee study of today, when a question was asked about how do you feel secure in the United States, the respondents answered that 43% of American Jews felt less secure in the United States today than they did 4 years ago. I point that out only because in conversations with others, I hear for the first time in my lifetime, people speaking about whether this is the time to consider leaving the United States. And I push back at saying, no, this is precisely the moment you want to be here, because this is the beginning of an exciting period of American history where I think we're going to be breaking down some of the barriers and some of these tensions if we are all committed to really working on this contract that I think defines who we are and how we operate. Look, I look at the data in Europe. I see the European story is very different. Europe today has fewer Jews than it has had in 1,000 years. And we see a significant number of Jews in large metropolitan areas, whether Greater London or Paris or elsewhere, making choices about leaving their respective societies and countries. I'm not at all of the mind that the United States is a sort of European replica. There are so many different factors to the American story, economically, politically, socially, and religiously, that I think create a different framework for being active American citizens.
So I have 2 questions I received. I'm going to try to combine them, and then I know Jen has one more question. So the last 2 questions I have are someone asking if you've tracked attitudes towards the civil rights movements, and have you seen any change over the past several years with the rise of Black Lives Matter? Is there a difference between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews in this? And then connected is, do you see Jewish voting patterns as different from African American and Latino voting patterns?
Well, lots of questions in one. So I'm going to try to take them apart, and I may not remember all parts, so I invite you please to
I can repeat that.
So for example, let's deal with Latino and African American voting patterns, because that's an easier and separate sort of issue. Latinos, one of my political science colleagues argues that Latinos and Jews are very close in their political behaviors. I don't see that quite the same. But they are closer than African Americans. African Americans will outvote Jews in terms of their support, for example, for the Democratic nominee this go around. They're much more deeply embedded with Joe Biden, even than American Jewish voters. We align probably somewhat closer to Hispanic voters, but disagree with them on some of the social values questions. So where Hispanics align with Orthodox Jews is, for example, around family values questions. And there is an interesting parallel. But on other topics, Hispanics align more closely with liberal American Jewish voters. So in some measure, Hispanics may be a closer partner to us than African Americans. On the questions about Black Lives Matter and what this all may mean in terms of attitudes and behavior. So this is a topic for another evening because it's extensive, it's interesting, and it's complex, and it's controversial. Indeed, Black Lives Matter is an interesting movement. Some 26 million Americans took to the streets this summer. This is the largest number of people to be activated and on our streets at any given time in our history. It's reflective of the passions people have around civil rights. The reflections show both whites and Blacks are deeply troubled by some of the issues that have been raised this summer by what we have seen in the criminal justice system and elsewhere. But what it does not point to is the complete and full embracing on the part of American Jews for everything that the Black Lives Matter movement stands for or represents. And that's where the rub becomes more complicated. First of all, Black Lives Matter is not a movement. It is really a series of localized chapters and movements. It is not centralized. Unlike the movement for Black Lives, which has a platform created in 2015, which is very clear in some of its expectations and far more radicalized than what we have even seen in part of the Black Lives Matter conversations and rhetoric this summer. There are a whole array of conversations that need to be had. American Jews need to understand what is happening and how Black Americans are feeling and functioning in a society where they have felt less than being a full part of the citizenry of the nation. And that is an economic issue, it is a policy issue, it's a racial issue, and it's certainly a criminal justice question. These issues are hard to say whether they divide the Orthodox world from the rest of American Jewry on these questions. I think there are some clear distinctions and considerations in the metropolitan New York area, in part because of the attacks on Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn and elsewhere, in Jersey City, and what we've seen across the Northeast. And that differentiates the politics and the relationships in those communities from the West, Midwest, and elsewhere. And I will point out to you that relationships in Los Angeles and in other parts of the United States between Blacks and Jews have some deep historic roots that are very positive. These differ to some degree between the tensions Blacks and Jews have faced in the greater New York area, going back to Brownsville in the 1960s, to issues around Hymietown in the Jesse Jackson 1990s, dealing with a host of political tensions between candidates running for public office, Blacks against Jews, a very different modality of relationships and connections. Geography, politics, and historic tensions have defined much of the Northeastern political ties between Jews and Blacks. That is simply not the pattern or the history of these relationships elsewhere in the country. So we need to look at locale as a part of the measure of how we define these questions. I think the bottom line here is that early on, rabbis in this community and across the country began opening a dialogue and relationship with African-American ministers, Hispanic clergy, and other minority clergy. And even in this community, that occurred well into the 1980s and 90s. And the residual effect of those relationships continues. What is needed now and what is absent now is the fact that this community is the only major American Jewish community without a community relations committee at its federation. And it is a loss that we do not have a vehicle that brings the community together around interfaith and interracial and interethnic relationships. And that was its profound work when it existed from 1933 to 2007, where it was deeply committed to building these connections. And as divisive as some issues are, there is a shared understanding that building connections with Korean Americans and African Americans and Hispanic Americans has a vital value to the Jewish community, both in terms of peace at home and relationships in the community, but also on behalf of the pro-Israel agenda that we share at least, and hopefully can convey to others, and that we can build other shared connections with communities that are really very vital to Jewish interests.
Thank you so much. I know we're at time. Are you okay to stick around for a few more minutes? How are you feeling?
I'm doing fine. I mean, this is only the third one today of this presentation.
I can give you, I'll give you maybe two more quick questions then, and you can answer them as you wish. For Orthodox Jews that vote Republican because they view their conservative values more in line, is there any debate or concern about separation of church and state? And while answering that, I know you said the discussion of modern Orthodox versus Orthodox is a whole other conversation in itself, but I had a few people mention they'd like to hear a little more about that as well.
Clearly, the issue of separation of church and state is a dividing point in the Jewish community. Historically, the major liberal expressions of support, liberal Jewish expressions, deeply fought for and sought to protect the division of church and state. The battleground there has ebbed and flowed and certainly diminished over time. I would say that there is certainly more room today for a greater incursion or engagement between religion and state. And part of that is seen and reflected in some of the court decisions we've seen. Part of that is reflected in some of the funding streams that have been opening to parochial education, to other agendas associated with sort of lowering the barriers between church and state. If you ask most liberal Jewish voters, they will tell you that is a cardinal issue of their identity and concern. But I suspect it is less of one in 2020 than it was for them in 1980, let us say. And I think that part of that is the more comfortable understanding that religion is a kind of public value. It has a place in American society and in American discourse. And maybe that has improved or changed the caliber of relationships about this consideration. But it deserves a conversation inside the Jewish community, which really doesn't happen other than when at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs every year, there is sort of this bottom line vote that's taken. Do we take a position of separation? And what are the grounds where we would give way to a point of view different from ours? But this needs to be much more deeply addressed than simply in a symbolic vote between institutions where the Reform movement will vote one way and the Union for Orthodox Hebrew Congregations another, and Agudath Israel possibly joining with the OU. My sense here is that these are all the issues that putting Jews together in a room would help at least frame why people feel so deeply as they do about their particular positions or postures. And that hasn't happened. And that, I think, is the call that we need to have for liberal Jews sitting with traditional Jews in conversations around faith, practice, ideas, and politics. The question also asked me to go elsewhere with this issue. Can you just remind me where else I'm to go?
Just with regards to modern Orthodox versus the Haredi community.
Yes, I mean, here we see the split in the Trump vote as one of the best examples of this kind of separation or divide. The higher level of Haredi support for the president and his policies versus the modern Orthodox position that tends to be more supportive of Democratic candidates and the Biden campaign in 2020. We don't have a great deal of study, and we will have much more as a result of this election. Because as I said in the formal presentation, what we are seeing in 2020 is the rise of the Orthodox community as a much more significant voter constituency. And part of that is certainly all about New York, for sure, whether it's Muncie or whether it's Brooklyn or the five towns, or whether we are talking about even New Jersey and some of the growth of the Jewish institutional and Jewish religious life of New Jersey and other East Coast communities where we are beginning to see these higher profile presence of Orthodox voters. So 2020 will give us a bit more clarity on these divisions inside the community, as well as the commonalities that we see. I think Orthodox Jews, along with the other American Jews, share a deep concern about the rise of violence in the society, of anti-Semitism in the society, of anti-Israelism in the society. And so that is a starting point for a dialogue that may very well be essential if we want to look at what brings us commonality or shared territory.
Thank you very much. This is the last one, I promise. And it'll be good because it'll leave us on a positive note, because some were surprised by your optimism in, changing the narrative going forward, regardless of the outcome of the election. And they just wanted to know why you feel that way, or what evidence do you see that the general population is committed to this moving forward?
That's actually a question that is a stumbling block for me. It's very difficult. I am a first generation American Jew. My parents escaped the Nazis. So their story of coming to the United States was all about Franklin Roosevelt, and I'll tell you why. My father had polio as a kid. His sponsor goes to the president and said, Mr. President, this candidate for admission to the United States will not be admitted because under US immigration law of 1938, one needed to be of perfect body and mind. And you, Mr. President, have had polio. So why not give this man a chance to demonstrate his Americanization, his American dream? So that allowed Franklin Roosevelt to sign a waiver that permitted my family and my mother and father to enter this country. So my optimism, in a sense, is driven by the fact that I sort of saw the American story in the family story and in the possibilities. Now, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, not a great, big Jewish community. We were 6,000 Jews. And we had one Orthodox congregation, one conservative, and one Reform. And we had to figure out a way to get to be together. So that occurred in a small community which was facing a huge challenge. The challenge was that this was a Jewish community in the capital of the Confederacy, in the midst of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 50s, and had to figure out how it would navigate itself in being a voice for responsible and conscientious leadership. And we figured it out in ways that led the Richmond News leader to write a threatening editorial, which could never and would never have been written had the Jews of Richmond not asserted themselves. Lox and bagels not wanted here, which basically was, guys, shut down your voices. We don't need to hear from your moral authority. And I don't think the community was prepared to be shut down, and lived through and sustained itself and rose to a moment that it could take great pride. When others were closing schools because they were going to integrate, the synagogues opened their buildings so that freedom schools could be created. So there are possibilities here that are extraordinary, and that's an old story, but for a new moment in time. Thank you all very much for inviting me to be part of your evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It was so nice to hear that last story. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, everybody, for joining. It will be available, the recording afterwards as well.